Good morning, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Annual Bluegrass Control Research Update, presented by PBI-Gordon and taught by Shawn Askew, Ph.D. My name is Lisa Wick. I'm Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs here at GCSAA, and will be today's moderator. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Shawn. We are recording today's event, and access to that recording will be sent as part of the follow-up email. Your audio is muted in this system, but we encourage you to ask questions as you go along. You can do that by clicking the raise hand button on the GoToWebinar control panel, and I can unmute you. Or you can type into the question answer box to provide your input. If your control panel has minimized, you'll see a narrow strip with an orange rectangle at the top. Click on that and the panel will expand and you'll be able to type in as well as download the handout that's available to you. Today's session is eligible for 0.1 GCSA education points. At the end of the program, we'll give you the code you can use on the association's website. We'll help you'll find today's webinar valuable. It is brought to us in partnership with PBI-Gordon. With a full line of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and other products, PBI-Gordon Corporation is a national leader in the professional turf and ornamental management industry. We thank them for their support and arrangement for education points today. Shawn Askew, Ph.D., obtained his bachelor's and master's degrees at Mississippi State University and Ph.D. at North Carolina State. He now serves as the Extension Turfgrass Weed Scientist for Virginia, an associate professor at Virginia Tech's Department of Plant Pathology, Physiology, and Weed Science. Since 2001, Askew has provided state leadership in the development and dissemination of weed control programs for turf and has coordinated the Phytochemistry and Radioactive Materials Laboratory and Virginia's Weed Identification Clinic. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Shawn Askew, Ph.D. Shawn?
All right, thanks a lot. Well, we only have 60 minutes and I tend to be long-winded, so let's get right into it. If my slide advance is going to work here. There we go. All right, so I was trying to think of a creative title to this presentation, and obviously I gave up. So annual bluegrass, a troublesome weed of ornamental turfgrass, what we're dealing with. So what I'll be covering today in this webinar is kind of a overview of Poa annua, kind of as we know it today, and also some seed-head suppression technology that it's getting to be kind of old news now, but it's something that I worked on starting almost a decade ago at Virginia Tech, and it's become pretty standard operating practice for improving Ethicon performance. And I'll also I really don't have enough time to get into a lot of specific herbicide recommendations or performance of this herbicide versus another. I welcome anyone to ask those questions. Perhaps we could look at maybe a different webinar on a future date for that topic, but I will talk about considerations that you need to have when designing or implementing a herbicide program for Poa annua, because it's never just applying a herbicide. There are always other considerations, cultural considerations to keep in mind. So we're going to review those. And then kind of the main premise of this webinar is going to be toward the end, where I give everyone an update on the Small Crops Research Initiative project, the SCRI project, which consists of 16 scientists, myself included, across the U.S., who received a grant from the USDA for approximately $6 million to look at nothing but Poa annua. And so that project is about a year in the saddle, and we already have some really exciting stuff that I can share with you on that. So we'll get into that toward the end. All right, so introduction to Poa annua, I can do that. This was my first license plate in the state of Virginia. I had this plate from about 2001 until 04, 05, maybe I may have kept it until about 06. I like the plate, and you know, the superintendents all got it, but it just seemed everywhere I went, people were asking me, you know, what's POA? You got a problem with people of Africa? You don't like people of Asia? And I tell them, no, it's got nothing to do with that. So I had to get rid of that. My license plate now is Weed Hater. So I kept the 8 in that. So annual bluegrass, yes, it's arguably the most troublesome weed of the golf industry, not only because of the aesthetic issues that it causes, but also playability issues, especially on putting greens. And the seed heads have a lot to do with that. So if you want to control or manage annual bluegrass, you have to understand annual bluegrass. And in some situations, as many of you know, we've abandoned the concept of control and have moved to culturing annual bluegrass on putting greens. There are certain environments where it is the most adapted grass for a putting surface. And that is a challenge because annual bluegrass is not in it for the long haul. It's an outstanding invader, but it does not do well with environmental stress. Now, we need to understand our enemy and know what it looks like. So this image is a really great one to show the different types of annual bluegrass that we'll encounter. So we have perennial POA right next to many different patches of annual POA, as well as weaving in and out of all this POA annua, you can see this darker green bent grass. So there's been a lot of literature published, and it's kind of common knowledge to many that perennial POA versus annual POA, they're often called biotypes. Well, recent research in the last decade or so has pretty much, and certainly in my opinion, disproven this myth. The perennial POA that they call variety reptans and the annual POA variety annua, they actually are not biotypes. They are not genetically distinct from one another. In fact, epigenetic controls are driving the phenotype that is expressed between these plants. If you take a perennial what's called a perennial biotype, if you take that plant out of a putting green situation and put it in a higher height of cut, it's going to revert back to the phenotype or the expression that one would expect from an annual plant. And so that's kind of an interesting discovery that's happened in recent years. And one of the things that, now I'm not a geneticist or an expert in these areas, but I am on a different national team looking at how epigenetics might be involved in developing herbicide resistance among a number of different weeds. And so that's another USDA funded project that I've been working on. But we certainly have perennial types and annual types. I've heard everything under the book about why they occur, southern versus northern. Based on my experience, 20 years working with POA, where you're going to see more perennial biotypes is in situations of lower heights of cut and situations where you have more intensive management, especially including plant growth regulators. Where you see annual types is where you don't use very many plant growth regulators, intensity of management is decreased, and the height of cut is increased. And that trend is going to be true no matter where you are. There certainly is a trend on POA population density. We have more of it in cooler climate areas, wetter areas, and less of it in warmer climate areas, drier areas. But you know, I can go to the south of Florida and find plenty of perennial biotypes on putting greens, depending on how those greens are managed. So we know what POA does, makes things look ugly. The bigger problem is that POA becomes a management nightmare, because even though it's an outstanding invader, it's almost impossible to manage in lieu of environmental stress. Here's out of California, Dr. Jim Baird showing us an image of a winter kill on putting green. Another great example of the type of sensitivity that POA has to winter stress compared to bent grass. In this case, this is a higher elevation green where in the previous summer they had loss of grass due to summer stress, and they used bent grass sod, which was the only thing available to them to repair the damaged areas. Now we're in the winter and we see all of this predominantly POA turf is being hit severely by ice damage, whereas the bent grass that was sodded the previous summer. So that's a really great example of the differential response between bent grass and POA to at least one environmental stress, ice damage. There are certain nematodes, especially in the West Coast, that predominantly attack POA without attacking bent grass, again, making it a management nightmare. And of course, we have diseases such as anthracnose and rapid blight that are predominantly going to attack poa annua. Spend a lot of money on those every year. And ABW has become a serious issue across the country. And again, you know, not only attacking POA, but it starts on POA and it predominantly attacks POA. So if we didn't have to deal with poa annua, you know, we possibly would have fewer expenses when it comes to some of these other pests. And then controlling annual bluegrass. As we know, it can be quite difficult, especially on putting greens, because putting green systems in general are more sensitive to stress, whether that stress is coming from aeration and sand top dressing or whether that stress is coming from a herbicide. Under ideal climate conditions, we can handle aeration and top dressing and the putting green will recover very quickly. Under less than ideal conditions, we may not handle it and we'll lose turf, especially on the cleanup passes. The same is true for a slightly injurious herbicide. We can dial in a rate that gives us selectivity against the POA with these herbicides, and under ideal environmental conditions, it'll work almost every time. But when we alter the environmental conditions just slightly, sometimes we can be shocked by the end result. And of course, amikarbazole is now being re-evaluated by FMC. Certainly not for use on putting greens. They're concentrating more on the fairway market and trying to dial in best management practices for their new formulation of Exonerate. Poa annua identification. This should be a review for many of you, but the large ligule, boat-shaped leaf tips, railroad tracks of the two-parted midrib that's going right down the middle of the leaf. The biggest problem that I often see is trying to differentiate poa annua from poa trivialis. And generally speaking, poa triv is going to have more of an orange-green color than poa annua. It grows more robustly, especially in the spring, and it does not produce seed heads as readily as poa annua. You'll also see a more stoloniferous nature to poa triv than poa annua. All right, so we talked about perennial versus annual types earlier. Here are some characteristics. Basically, the perennial type is an adaptation to low mowing height primarily. And what does the plant need to do? Well, with less height, it needs to maximize photosynthetic efficiency. So the plants pack more leaves in a smaller area. And since they're doing that, I think it's a byproduct of that, the altered physiology of maximizing their solar efficiency changes their physiology such that they do not produce seed heads as much. And I think that the fact that they turn into a perennial is an artifact of that reduced seed head production. So poa annua plants that produce copious numbers of seed heads on every tiller that the plant makes, that is an extreme carbohydrate drain on the plant. And so when any type of summer stress occurs, these annual types are going to check out. They're going to decline down below the bentgrass canopy. Most of them are going to die. These perennial plants are not losing carbohydrate. In fact, if anything, they're maximizing their photochemical efficiency, and they're just storing carbohydrate because they're not producing those seed heads. And these plants are more in it for the long haul. They're going to survive summer stress. They're going to persist longer than the annual plants would. So just some key characteristics between those two. Okay, so I'd like everyone to pay attention and please answer our participant poll. This is one of 3 polls where I've got some just very simple questions for you. Assuming a perfect putt, you know, will always hole out when the ball rolls over pure creeping bentgrass. Will rolling over a patch of annual bluegrass on the same putting green make some of those balls miss? So we're going to get a difference between rolling over pure creeping bentgrass where we would hole out every time. Will we not hole out on the exact same greens management, same mowing height, everything is immaculate. Like if you close your eyes and you rub your hand across that patch of POA, you cannot feel it, you cannot distinguish it. But when you open your eyes, you see the density change, you see the color change between the POA and the bent. So I'm curious to know if y'all think on a perfectly executed putt, will it make any difference whatsoever? Many people say that it does. All right, Lisa, so I guess I'm just going to go ahead with the the presentation, and you're going to
Now,
update us
now,
on.
be patient. I know
Oh, I
it
got the
seems like it's taking a while. They're voting. I can see
that's
it coming
fine.
in. It's only been 45 seconds.
All right.
But
Well, the reason I asked this question is because the next few slides that we're going to cover is going to very quickly review a large body of research that one of my students and I recently completed and published 2 articles in the journal Crop Science, where we actually put data on paper to answer this question. So,
okay, and so I'm closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2. And there is what your
sweet.
audience thinks.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that also tells me that one reason why this debate has persisted, for years and years, because it is not difficult whatsoever to find golf literature as well as turf management literature that will routinely state without credibility and without citing actual data that poa annua affects golf putts. I think it's empirically observed by some people. Maybe they watch their ball respond differently after it rolls over a particular patch. I think on a pure poa green, you probably will have improved putting conditions over bent grass. The problem, in my mind, is when we have pure bent grass and there's this low density level of poa, something at or less than 30%, where the ball is rolling through a less dense bent grass, then it encounters a more dense poa annua, then it's rolling on a less dense bent grass, etc. All right, so let's look at what we
And
did
I'm
at
going to
Virginia.
interject here because somebody also typed in, it'll only work if there are no seed heads.
All right, well, so I'll speak to that. So we did several experiments. We started out in the laboratory. Actually, we built a putting laboratory, and we spent 2 years rolling tens of thousands of golf balls across synthetic turf in a laboratory to better understand the physics involved with different rolling devices or putt simulating devices. And what we found was a couple of things. One was that the rolling devices available on the market, the stimp meter, the greens tester, they had way too much inherent variability in how the ball rolls down the device and exits the device. The variability in that led to more directional deviation than the actual variability in putting green canopies. So we designed and developed, we modified a golf training aid called the Pendulum Perfect, and put an electromagnetic release and some other modifications to turn that into a mechanical putter or putting robot. And we used that we also noticed in our laboratory experiments that the last 12 to 14 inches of ball roll, the ball's inertia tends to dissipate so much that frictional forces on the green can make the ball turn left, right. It can do any number of things. And that's why we're trained as golfers to putt past the cup. And so I did not want that large amount of directional deviation that occurs in the last 5% of your putt to affect our data. So what we invented was a system where we use pressure sensitive paper. So we have a strike plate where the ball will slam into this pressure sensitive paper, and it'll make a mark on the paper, and that tells us what direction the ball was headed upon impact, so we don't have that final deceleration of the ball. And we use a high-speed camera and some other techniques. And let me, maybe I need to click on my screen here, Lisa, to get it back going again. All right. So here's the experimental setup. We've got our high-speed camera right here. The ball is going to be putted with a mechanical putter. Right about here is a poa annua patch. We're going to do in many, many different golf courses, many, many different putting greens, and many, many different transects per putting green. We rolled one ball adjacent to the poa patch and another ball right beside on the exact same track, same slope, everything over the top of that poa patch. So one of the hardest things we had to do was find really good candidate poa patches with really uniform, blemish-free bent grass everywhere else. But we did that, and we ran multiple of these experiments, and we collected high-speed camera data as well as our positional data using the pressure-sensitive paper. And this is what that looks like, the pressure-sensitive paper. When you have pure bent grass, you have a really tight cluster of the balls. When you roll over a POA patch, you do not. And so this was the first evidence that POA actually can steer a golf putt. When we use something like the greens tester, just as we observed in the laboratory, the variability of the greens tester itself was way too high to detect any difference. It was not able to do so. But just like in our laboratory experiments, every time we did this, thousands of golf balls rolled, what we measured was a lateral imprecision of somewhere between 4 and 5 millimeters of left-right deviation per meter of ball travel. And that was also consistent outdoors on the actual in-play putting green. So our mechanical putter system with all of our controls in place is giving us just under 5 millimeters per meter of variability. So you think about how wide a golf cup is, you're looking at about approximately probably 1.5 inches is your safe zone, maybe even less than that, 1.25 inches left and 1.25 inches right. So you're looking at, say, 2.5 inches in the middle of that cup being your sweet spot. So if you want to stick to that, then you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of about 35 to 40 millimeters. So we're talking about a perfectly executed putt at 5 millimeters per meter, giving us, you should be able to hold that out pretty much every time if it were perfectly executed on about a, what is that, approximately 7 meter putt. So you're talking about a 20-foot putt. So with our mechanical putter, we should be able to hold out almost every time on a 20-foot putt. If we were rolling over POA annua, though, we can pretty much cut that in half. The deviation there, it added a good 7 or more millimeters. So the actual increase in variability was higher than the total variability from pure bent grass, if that makes sense. So with all the work that we did, I can definitively say that yes, now not under all conditions, but yes, POA annua will alter the direction of a golf putt. How do you account for that? Putt like the pros. What does he mean by that? What do the pros do that we don't have the confidence to do? They'll putt it 8 foot past the cup because they've got the confidence to easily putt back an 8-foot putt. That's not me, okay? I don't have that confidence. I want to be within 12 inches. And so the more inertia you can give the ball, the less these tiny deviations in frictional forces caused by something like higher density POA are going to affect your putt. So yes, you can overcome these effects and make them absolutely negligible, but on a perfectly executed putt that's designed to roll approximately 12 to 14 inches past the back of the hole or a couple of revolutions behind the cup, then POA annua can have a substantial effect. It's probably helping me more than it's hurting, but it's there. Here's another great example showing you how POA can affect the ball. So I think what's happening is when the ball encounters, now this is our high-speed camera data, every dot at 10,000 frames per second is the center of the golf ball as it's tracking along. Now, the ball is not bouncing as much as we see on this graph because, you know, notice this is only 2 millimeters. My little laser pointer right here is 2 millimeters wide on your screen. And so so it's magnified somewhat because of the way it's graphed, but what we're looking at is the ball's bounce and travel. And notice as soon as it hits the POA, 2 things happen. It turns direction and moves in a totally different direction. Now it looks like we're climbing up in the air. That wasn't happening. It was just the perspective of the ball relative to the camera was slightly skewed, so it's not perfectly straight. But as soon as the ball hit the POA annua, it turned direction and it started bouncing wildly. All right. And so these are what we're seeing here are X coordinates in pixels. So we only are looking at 1.5 feet or so of travel along this entire graph. But anyway, again, another bit of evidence that we showed to be significant over many, we actually analyzed data from the area under the curve for these bounces, and we're able to show after encountering the POA, things were significantly increased in terms of directional deviation and bounce. So anyway, that's how POA affects putting green canopy texture, which affects the direction of golf putts. So it is pretty important to try to manage either for a more pure poa annua situation or a more pure bentgrass situation when you have blotchy poa all over the place, and especially when those poa are producing seed heads. In most of our work, seed head production was less than 25% of the poa annua canopy. We were a little bit later in the summer with this work, so we still had some remnants of seed heads, but it was not prime seed head time of the year. I wanted to simulate a condition that was not a most extreme case, so that our data would be more realistic for the average golfer. So I didn't want to emulate just this tiny 5 week out of the year window. So we were looking at more early summer to midsummer conditions. All right.
Okay, there's a question here, Shawn, though. What about height of cut? Wouldn't that have a great effect on the putt?
What about height of cut? Absolutely, that would have an effect. And certainly, one of the questions that I have now moving forward, we're trying to take our mechanical putt system and develop we're trying to test the correlation of things that use accelerometer data, like the perimeter. I also looked at Dr. McElroy's Spiro ball, and we are showing that the perimeter for sure, which is a device that you roll across the putting green, it is highly correlated with directional deviation that we're getting from our mechanical putter, regardless of the anomaly that's causing directional deviation. One of the questions I have moving forward that I cannot answer this question definitively, and I would like to, is what about grain? What about species? We have zoysia greens and Bermuda greens in the Richmond area, the Independence Golf Club, being overseen by Jordan Booth. And so moving forward, we plan to do additional research to look at how things like mowing height and species will affect putt consistency. Now, as far as how the interaction with poa annua and height of cut, my opinion would be that the higher your height of cut, the more your directional deviation would be when you encounter a density change between, like rolling over a poa patch. Because what's happening is the poa is lifting the ball slightly out of the canopy, and then when the ball comes down, it plows into that low density bent grass, which makes the ball more prone to being steered just slightly off course because of that greater interaction with the canopy. If the ball just rolled smoothly over the top of a high density, low height of cut canopy, the chances of this happening are less and less. All right.
Okay, there's another question here, and that is, what about time of day? Does that have an effect on the speed?
Yes, the more poa grows, the more interaction you're going to have with the poa, and it's going to be outpacing bent grass. So it's just going to magnify the disparity between the two species. All right, so to avoid the risk of making this into a ball roll presentation, let's move on. All right, so seed head suppression. All right, the innovation that I talked about that I'm only going to hit on very briefly is this concept of early application, either a fall application, which is what we're routinely recommending now, or winter application. In fact, the window, as I'll summarize for you in just a moment, for your early seed head suppression application with a product like Ethifon is going to be anywhere between November 15th and February 15th. So we are right there in the window. If you want to improve performance and consistency of Ethifon, especially on putting greens and also on fairways, but more so on putting greens, then you're right in the middle of the window right now. You're cool until, at least for most of the Mid-Atlantic region where we are now. I know there's some weird places out west where you have seed head issues pretty much year round, and I can't speak to that. But for our seasonal climate over here, we're in the middle of my recommended time of year for the early application for seed head suppression. What does that mean? Look at this graph. We're looking at annual bluegrass covered with seed heads as a percentage. So a really tall, big line like the non-treated here in black is a bad thing. That means we had more and more, up to 70% of the poa that was out there was covered in seed heads, and over time. So we're looking at time relative to the first spring application in days. So our untreated check, from the time we started applying, seed heads started to occur, and they lasted all the way out to about 80 days into the season. When we used a spring-only growing degree day timed application of Proxy plus Primo, at recommended rates, 5 fluid ounces of proxy per 1,000, 0.125 of primo per 1,000 on bent grass putting greens. We see that we've cut that about in half, and the overall duration of POA was reduced significantly. We often see problems of inconsistency in the first 4 to 5 weeks. After that second application of proxy or any of whatever your ethylene product is goes out, normally we're pretty clean after that point, right? But notice when we used a early application, in this case it was a winter application, probably applied in January. Well, actually I shouldn't say probably. What this actually is a combination of many, many different trials, and these would have been January or February applications in this case. We've since done a lot of work in the fall with November, December applications, and if anything, the trend suggests they work even better. But oftentimes I don't see a statistical difference between November and February. All right, October's a little early, March is a little late for us. Here's just a couple of images showing that. So here we're looking at proxy by itself applied in January, followed by a spring application. This is proxy with only the 2 spring applications. That would be a growing degree day timed initial application, which is going to be at a base 32. You're looking at about 400 units. All right, and that's what we're looking at here and over here. If my, come on, laser pointer. There we go. And then here's proxy by itself with a January app, with a February app, and with a March. Notice that the March is not performing as well as January or February. Just another example, here's your untreated check. Here's proxy with an early app followed by the spring program. Excellent seed head suppression there. There's the spring only. So here's one of those situations where inexplicably proxy is just not stepping up. I mean, we're probably getting 30% reduction, maybe 40 in that particular plot. But when we have the early application, my experience has been much more consistent and better results. I will say that at our research putting greens here on the Virginia Tech campus, we often see better seed head suppression than I do out in the state, up in the Washington, D.C. area, on golf courses that have a history of PGR use. It seems our consistency falls off and the overall level of seed head suppression we get is reduced. Whether that's due to resistance, possibly building up to some of these PGRs, it's hard to say. No one's really looked at that I'm aware of, something I've been wanting to do for some time. Another trial looking at seed head suppression, excellent results anytime we got an early application, and you can see, if you look at that plot up close, you'll see pretty good seed head suppression from spring only, but not as good.
So the question now is, are there any soil temperature guidelines for that early application of proxy primo?
Okay, that's a good question. So I usually recommend counting the growing degree days, and I have done so using soil temperatures at multiple depths on putting greens to no avail. So my argument is the difference in the growing degree days that would be accumulated using soil temperature either at a ½ inch depth or a 4-inch depth will not be different enough. You're looking at a plus or minus 3-day difference and not a biologically relevant difference between just using locally sourced, internet-based air temperature data, or especially if you have your own on-course temperature station, a weather station, just using your air temperature data from that. Now, otherwise, we can argue that 55 degrees sustained soil temperature, 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and sustained, what the hell does that mean? So like, if you're getting above 55 degrees for 5 or 6 days in a row, you can expect poa annua to start popping. The problem is when you look at soil temperature data over time, it's these crazy zigzags. I'll just imagine that there's a graph on our image here. Soil temperature is doing this. It's like this big squiggly in data over time. And so trying to identify, you can slowly see that the squiggly gets higher and higher as it squiggles, but trying to identify, hey, when would you say that we were above 55 degrees sustained? That's why we use growing degree days, because it takes all of that variable information and boils it down to a nice, smooth, continuous line. When it reaches 400 units at a base 32, boom, it's time to spray. The big debate is when to start. I usually recommend February 1st, especially when doing base 32 in the transition zone, because we can get some erroneous over 32 degree accumulated heat units in January that, in my opinion, aren't very meaningful for the total. It's kind of flukier type stuff. It's going to get really cold after that, and it doesn't seem to me that, I think we get early starts when we use January 1st as a start date. I recommend February 1st. And so you just saw a couple of, I'm going to back up there, you see these really good performing combo products that included a November application. And when we compare that to just the old spring program, here's Proxy by itself, and a little bit better performance with Proxy Primo, but neither of them compare to the with fall programs that you saw earlier. All right, checking our time. I think we're looking pretty good for the material that I want to cover. All right, Civitas. We've looked at that as well as other crop protection type products. You saw some of those in the previous slide. I really did not see an effect from Civitas. So the good news is I did not see a negative impact on seed head suppression. As long as Ethifon products are in the tank with Civitas, you're going to get really good seed head suppression performance. At least that's been my experience. Same trends where the early application, like a November application, is going to give you improved seed head suppression the following spring. But one thing that these pigment-containing products do is they can maintain winter color. Here's an example in Blacksburg, Virginia, where we shoveled snow to get this area melted enough for us to take our data. And underneath, we've got pretty darn good-looking turf. Again, it's a coloring effect from the Civitas, but to the average golfer, that's going to be a much better looking green where we have products like Signature, like Civitas. And in the case of Signature, we've even seen improved Poa annua tolerance. So oftentimes Ethifon is going to discolor Poa annua. It causes a yellow to orange coloration. Some of these products like Fiata and Signature will reduce Poa annua injury slightly. And I wonder, for my northern colleagues, would that lead to less Poa annua winter kill? So if you're doing the early apps, I haven't seen in my area situations where early application plus spring application of Ethifon leads to decline in Poa annua. I have seen, especially with Embark and some of the older products, and even with Ethifon to a certain extent, slight reduction in tiller rate. And so overall Poa cover, the expansion of the Poa in the spring is a little bit less. And then we can sometimes have this yellow to orange color, especially when you have intermittent frost events in the spring. As we're greening up, you'll see more of that yellow discoloration from Ethifon on the Poa. You don't really see it on the bent. And I've seen things like Signature, Fiata reduce that, not just mask it with the colorant, but reduce the overall injury level to Poa. So that's something that I would call promising. This is what I'm recommending, at least definitely to people in my general area. For the winter application, especially for people that want to maintain color moving into the winter, two things. My opinion is that you should use Proxy alone or Ethifon products alone, or if you're worried about color loss, which can often happen as you're moving into the fall season, PGRs like Ethifon, like Primo, Trinexpac Ethyl, they're going to cause frost-associated brownout of the turf. And the more PGR you put in the tank, the more you're going to see this brownout. If you are expecting your putting greens to go completely brown and dormant anyway, no big deal. If you want to maintain winter color, then only use Ethifon in the fall, and also possibly add a pigment type product in there to mask the discoloration. So that's going to go out between November 15th and February 15th. And then you follow up with Proxy plus Primo, or an Ethifon product plus a Trinexpac Ethyl product, initially when you reach 400 to 450 growing degree days at base 32, and then a follow-up 3 to 4 weeks later. So that's kind of the standard recommendation. Okay, so next participant poll question. How aggressively do you target annual bluegrass in managed turf. And I've got kind of 4 levels that I've added there. Routinely use PGRs, but seldom herbicides. Routinely use herbicides, but seldom PGRs. I routinely use both of them to target annual bluegrass. Or not really, ever now and then. POA is not that big of a problem for me.
Okay, while this vote's going on, there's several different questions that come in. Most of them I think you answered, but here's one. Is it too late to apply a fall-winter application in the Northeast, he's in Massachusetts, during a thaw period? What if there was no snow but frozen soils?
That's a good question, and I can tell you that with our research, we have actually got, now we're walking onto a putting green with special research equipment and hand applying with a tiny boom. Okay, so when you think about what equipment might do to the green, that's a totally different topic. All right, so I'm only speaking to what Ethifon would do to the green, and we have sprayed frozen greens. We have waited most of the way through the day and finally said, forget it. We can't wait for this green to thaw out. It's not going to thaw. We've sprayed frozen greens before and have not seen a problem. I've never seen an association to severe winter stress and putting green injury. My concern, though, is that the severity of our winter stress in Blacksburg. Now we are a mountainous location, but we're still not going to mimic what's happening in upstate New York and northern Michigan. So in areas where you can lose POA annua just due to winter stress, I would be somewhat concerned about what my practices were. I wouldn't go whole hog and spray all my greens with something I've never done before, especially in a situation where I'm trying to manage for reducing winter kill. So that's something that I really can't speak to, but I don't have any evidence from all the work that we've done that Ethifon in particular is harming the bentgrass, but more so the type of injury we see on POA. For us, it's always been a transient discoloration or slight stunting of growth, not really a loss of turf type situation. All right, so interesting data coming back. I would imagine that most people that are going to use herbicides would also use PGR. So we do see that reflected in the data, and that 23% versus 10% only herbicides. So, and I would imagine folks that are only using herbicides are probably not, well, I don't know, that may depend, because one could use something like Benslide or Bensamec and claim that, that's my program for greens, but typically herbicides for POA control are going to be more often applied in the rough or in the fairway. But we're going to get into that. That's why I asked this question. We're transitioning into more strategies, or at least thoughts that one would want to have for overall control. And it's my privilege, and Lisa, I didn't tell you about this because I didn't know about it. As of this morning, I was just notified by some colleagues of mine. I don't know how many of you remember. Where's my laser pointer here? There we go. All right. You see that herbicide right there under my herbicides for bentgrass and Kentucky bluegrass category, methiozoline. So the trade name or proposed trade name for that product is POAcure. And as of yesterday, about midday, it had never been registered in the United States. But the EPA stamped the final approval for the federal label for POAcure December 9th, 2019. And so now the company still has to submit for and receive state registrations. That typically for some states could be as quickly as a few weeks. And for some states, it may take as much as 3 months or so. I would say most of the U.S. will have the state registrations in place by March, most likely. And so this is huge news for anybody that's wanting to control POA annua. If you recall, I know there would have to be a number of people on this webinar that have worked with this product, but it has taken so long to get the registration that many may have forgotten about it, or some of our newer superintendents may have never evaluated it. But back about 10 years ago, this product was discovered, and in 2010 it was registered in Korea under the name of POA Bosca. And there was a lot of research done by pretty much all of the major U.S. universities on methiazolin and its effects on putting greens. And I've published peer-reviewed papers. Jim Brosnan, Aaron Patton, many others have published peer-reviewed papers on it. And then all of a sudden, you know, the radio waves kind of went silent, because they submitted for registration. They had an EUP, and the whole process was wrought by a lot of requirements by EPA, and one of the biggest blows for the product was kind of in the middle of all this. EPA wanted this new honeybee data, and so that pretty much doubled the registration time for the product. So here we are 10 years in. I think a lot of people probably have lost faith, have decided that this product was never going to come to market. You are the first to hear. I literally, the email just came in from the EPA that yesterday they had stamped the federal registration approval for PoaCure. So you should start hearing more about this product in the very near future. So,
and as you mentioned, Shawn, states have different labels, and so one of the things I always say is the label is the law, and you have to know what you can use at your location and on your golf course, and make sure that you're doing that in accordance with the label.
absolutely. Absolutely, and on this particular product, distribution is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen in the turf industry. So the company that manufactures the company is going, or the product is going to distribute directly to superintendents. And by the way, this product, as it comes out of the gate with the EPA, my understanding is they only sought initially registration for use on golf courses. And so this is going to be initially golf only, and as they get their feet wet in the U.S. market, they will start to expand into other markets like athletic fields and things like that. And it's my understanding that superintendents are going to be able to create like they go to a website and create actually a user account, and the company is going to give you customized, based on your input, give you customized recommendations for exactly how to use them. But the primary use is on putting greens. And so, as you'll see in just a moment when I get into this information, using a herbicide on putting greens is no joke, and you definitely want to have the absolute best information available. And so this product's been registered in Japan and Korea for quite some time now. I think the registration in Australia is imminent, and no one predicted that it would take 10 years to get it registered in the US, but it did. And I'm very happy for the superintendents, because I've done a lot of work. I was the first person in the United States to spray this product on US soil, and I know how much it's going to reduce your stress. The only thing really to worry about with that product in terms of controlling POA, especially on greens, is dialing in how quickly the POA is going to check out. That's our biggest concern. The extreme safety on bent grass is such that it just makes it, well, easier than any other product that I've ever evaluated. But anyway, that's really exciting news, and so I wanted to share that with you all. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of our information here. So we've got, if we're going to go after Poa annua, we're going to have to do two things. I mean, traditionally one would think, oh, we just get a herbicide and kill it. It's not that simple with Poa. You know, one doesn't just simply control Poa annua. And so we're going to always have to look at ways to maximize desirable turf competition with the Poa while we're trying to slowly kill the Poa. And if you kill the Poa too quickly, then you have voids in the canopy, which for certain high-end types of turf like putting greens is a big, big problem. And then we have some markets where these things have been considerably easier. Bermuda grass and zoysia grass, we have a plethora of herbicides that can fairly easily kill POA without harming the desirable turf, but we're developing resistance to every one of them. And Dazaflam is the only one out of this list that we currently don't have resistant biotypes that have been characterized in Bermuda and zoysia. The real challenge, though, is where in northern turf grasses where we have to, you've got PGRs, and you got different herbicides, and you're trying to put your toe in the water and not cause injury, and it can be a challenge. So let's talk a little bit about some of those cultural practices. Okay, this is just a very rough estimate, okay? It's not really based on data. It's based on empirical observation of a ranking of turfgrass competition with Poa annua at 2 different mowing heights. And, you know, creeping bentgrass, I think one of the reasons that some of these plants are more associated with Poa annua, like creeping bentgrass and Kentucky blue, is because the management requirements for the desirable turf more closely match the desires and wants of Poa annua. So as I said, it's all about altering turfgrass competitive potential with the POA. If you're not doing that in conjunction with something that's harming the POA, you're not going to be successful. You know, managing moss on greens is very similar in that respect. If you're not doing something that's limiting the growing environment and maximizing competition with moss, you're not going to be able to take the moss out in the long term. It's going to bounce right back. And, you know, POA, like moss, they're both extremely rapid and successful invaders, and that's part of the problem. So cultural considerations, choosing appropriate turf. A lot of these things that are on this list are common sense type stuff, but in many cases you don't have the flexibility to do what you know is best. You know, play of the game or demands of your clientele are going to trump, you know, what you know to be the best cultural practices. But certainly always keep in the back of your mind, anything you can do to increase turf competition is going to be of paramount importance when dealing with POA. And so, you know, think about avoiding compaction, especially on greens. How are we managing our cleanup laps? You know, are we causing too much stress on cleanup laps? Is there something that you can do to alter your program? Because all of those type things will play in. Not irrigating routinely, but instead allowing your surface to be as dry as often as possible and managing for what the turf needs. Not avoiding especially phosphorus fertilizer in the fall of the year when the bulk of Poa annua is going to be germinating. Basically, that's a starter fertilizer for the Poa seedlings, so you definitely don't want to do that. So choose appropriate turf grass. Why would we do that? Well, it reduces management inputs, it reduces POA seed production that are then going to be spread to the rest of the course. How do we do that? To the best of your ability, and again, we're not always in control, matching the turf type to the climate, considering reduced input areas wherever possible just to reduce the overall POA seed production that can be tracked onto other areas. Here's a great example of adapted grasses. This is the transition zone showing you a fescue lawn compared to a zoysia grass lawn. And again, wants and needs of your clientele may determine that you have to use a different type. Again, anything that you can do to reduce management in some of these areas so you can increase management in some of these areas is going to be a good thing. If you don't have the budget to keep the entire course clean of Poa annua, then focus that budget on the places that golfers are most concentrated and try to keep those areas clean so that golfers are not picking up Poa seed and bringing them to your greens where the playability issues are highest. Keep the surface dry. Poa is a wet weather type plant. It can grow pretty much anywhere, even you know, arid and dry land, but it's going to be more common in wet conditions. Surface moisture just promotes more seed to germinate. It promotes the survival of these shallow-rooted seedlings when they're trying to compete in the early stages. So anything you can do to reduce surface moisture is going to allow more of those little seedlings to succumb to turf stress or environmental stress, turf competition, environmental stress. Here's an example of voids in Kentucky bluegrass, and boom, you know, Poa annua is going to be very rapid to take advantage of any issue that opens up the turf canopy. Oh, we're running out of time. I need to speed it up. All right, mowing correctly, that just reduces stress on the turf. As you can see, you don't want those types of things and turf having to heal from that dull mower disease. Avoiding compaction, again, reduces turf on the stress, more oxygen to the roots, more growth potential, and more ability to keep that very successful invader out. You can see there on cleanup laps on greens. All right, I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. Another thing to think about, use non-treated checks. Put a doormat out in areas where you're going to spray so that you can track what Poa annua is doing over time, so that, you know, a treatment program that can at least hold Poa in check may not be evident if you don't know that Poa populations would have increased over time, whereas all you're doing is holding them constant. Here's an example. If your initial look like this and 2 years out look like that, you're going to say, man, I spent a lot of money for nothing. But if you had a check plot and you knew that 2 years out would have looked like this, you're like, sweet, that product is awesome. It's a big difference in perception there. All right, last participant poll. Do you have herbicide-resistant annual bluegrass on your golf course? Yes.
While they're doing this one, Shawn, there's a number of questions that have come in here.
Okay.
The first
That's
is
unfortunate because Father Time is not really
talking. I know. That's why we're doing it while they're voting. Two things at once.
Okay.
Are there any issues with Poa Cure when you use it on greens that have been treated with quicksilver for moss?
Potentially. Okay, so there is potential for the we don't exactly know what the mode of action of Poa Cure is. There is a possibility from some of the proposed modes of action that they would be that there would be a synergistic reaction with quicksilver. We have not seen direct evidence, but it's possible. Now, we know that that is an issue with bensulide or Bensimec, one of PBI-Gordon's products. You want to avoid using that product for Poa management on greens in conjunction or within 2 weeks of a quicksilver application. So it's no problem to have quicksilver on that green and Bensimec on that green, just not within 2 weeks of one another. Because we see it's unpredictable when it's going to happen, but we do see an interaction between the organophosphate Bensimec and the quicksilver. With Poa Cure, that is not proven at this point, but possible.
Okay, great. And I'm going to do one other quick question here before we close the poll, and that is, will a Primo Proxy application the week before aeration slow recovery?
Yes. Will a Primo Proxy application a week before aeration slow recovery? Yes, most likely it will. That's the big challenge for spring seed head suppression, is trying to get a handle on how we're going. What are we doing for Poa suppression? What are we doing for just seed head suppression? And what do those PGRs do to the rate of lateral recovery after aeration? So when do we time our aeration event relative to our seed head suppression program and the onset of our PGR program on the greens? And to my knowledge, no one's ever given us definitive answers on that. It's going to be a matter of you know, promoting your cultural practice as much as possible. We did, I've done one protocol where we were trying to look at this question, and unfortunately the site was lost due to things outside of our control. And so we didn't get really good data from that trial, but the big question is, can, you know, if we're using an early app to give us that fall seed head suppression power, are we as dependent on growing degree days as we thought we always were? And I say maybe not. I say maybe we can come out in the spring with a reduced rate and possibly get our aeration grown in before we kick it up a notch with our seed head suppression program. But those are theories. No real data on that. All right, so we've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to try to get through our update on the, oh wait, you've got to close the poll. Well, you did. Okay. Yes, yeah, confirmed 10%, 49%, not which I'm aware. that seems reasonable for the number of people we have on this poll. What we believe is happening is that more and more every year we're having more and more cases of resistance. Okay, there we go. And that's one of the reasons that this SCRI project was initiated. You see the universities down here on the bottom that are all participating in this. And I don't think we're gonna have time to do it. I plan to go to this website, which is resistpoa dot something or another. It's either a .com or a .org.
Here it is, right here.
All right. And so this is a great resource. When you go into key information, what you're going to find is more and more materials are going to be uploaded. We're looking at tools. We have slide sets that are on here. Only 3 so far, but as we're only a year in, and as we continue to make discoveries, all of that information is going to be pumped into this website. So this is going to be a one-stop shop for information about not only what the team is finding, but also what we are compiling of already existing information about managing POA annua and managing resistant weeds in general. All right, thank you, Lisa, for bringing us all back here.
You bet.
All right, here's the cooperators there, and I'm just going to go through. As I said, the website, we just looked at that, so I can skip that. This is some of the preliminary data. We're doing total of 2,000 populations are being screened for resistance to a number of herbicides. Here you can see a list of herbicides and numbers of resistant populations that have already been discovered from our screens across the various states. So far, we're just about a year in. We've got 776 populations that have screened. Our overall target is 2,000. We're doing over 10 screens per population, so you're looking at over 20,000 different screens. We have multiple objectives in this project, and they can be varied as different management techniques. One of the things that I'm working on now is non-chemical products and alternative controls. And one of the things that we did for that is we actually did keyword searches in Google and looked at hundreds and hundreds of return pages. And this one's kind of interesting. If you type in annual bluegrass into, let's say you wanted organic weed control annual bluegrass, if you type that in, when you add annual bluegrass to that search term, you suddenly skew your data to all synthetic herbicides. So this hash line is with POA or annual bluegrass added to the search term. And notice how very few pages return. Most of the pages are going to be returned if you don't have annual bluegrass in your search term. This is kind of looking at what consumers would see for non-synthetic products. It's kind of an interesting result. We'll be doing work on that. Here's a great extension resource that was developed mainly by Jay McCurdy at Mississippi State, but with the input from the team, and that poster is going to be coming out and available to people, hopefully at the GIS. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to be distributing those. If you want to be a survey site and allow someone from your state to collect POA populations to be screened for resistance, there's basically go to that Resist POA website. Also follow what's happening on Twitter with the hashtag Resist POA, and you'll find plenty of information about what's currently happening with this project. All right, so went a little over on time. Apologize about that. I think I got bogged down in some of that herbicide information, but pretty exciting times. And you know, I would be happy to, you know, Lisa, if you guys were interested in doing more of a herbicide-centric presentation. I think a lot of people, that's often the questions that I get is, what do I use? When do I use it? How do I use it? At what rate should it be used? And what should I be looking out for? That's the kind of information that most people want.
Yeah, I'm seeing based on the questions that had come in, that's a definite statement there, Shawn.
Right.
We thank you for teaching this. There's lots of great information that people will be able to use right away. We thank PBI-Gordon as well. Those of you who are listening, you'll want to enter the code 999-22945-30291 on the GCSA website to receive your external education points. Anyone who's listening to the recording, make sure you use the date you're listening rather than the presentation date so that those get applied to the correct cycle. We do have a number of upcoming live webinars. I'm going to give you a couple. Oh, there's lots of thank yous, and this is great info. Things in the question answer box for you, Shawn.
And let me just jump in there real quickly. See, anybody that has additional questions that we didn't get to during the webinar, feel free to email me. It's really easy to find, saskew@vt.edu, or if you Google it, or go to Virginia Tech, you should be able to find me fairly easily. There's not a whole lot of Shawn Askews out there, so just email me, and I may not be within the hour, but I will get back to you.
And it works lots better if you use the VT correctly rather than my typo.
Yeah, it does. It's amazing how that works.
Yeah. When can you introduce Trim-It back into your program in conjunction with Proxy?
Okay, usually once you are done with your seed head suppression, and as soon as you have your aeration grown in, is when you should start moving on Trim-It. So the Primo is in there with Proxy to reduce or to improve quality, because Proxy by itself, especially when it starts getting warmer in the season, Proxy can start to make bent grass get a little leggy. And if you, well, we wouldn't do this, but if you were to extend Proxy application into hot periods of the year, you're going to cause crown rising of bent grass and associated scalping. Primo can help with that, but it won't. You shouldn't be using Proxy though into really warm periods of the year, because for at least us Mid-Atlantic folks, the POA seed head season is starting to dissipate at that point anyway. Trim-It is not going to have the same level of quality enhancement that Primo would, but certainly you can either, as soon as your aeration recovery is about complete, you can move into Primo for the first part of the season and then transition to Trim-It. Or, I would say as soon as you have the turf quality that you're looking for, you're ready to go with Trim-It. That's what I will be waiting for, is get my turf quality where I want it to be in the spring, and then move to Trim-It. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Gulf Industry Show coming up. On the team for Resist POA, Shawn mentioned Jay McCurdy, who will be teaching with Jared Hoyle and Maggie Ryder, one of the new seminars. And if you haven't gone to the lightning round learning, Jay's going to be in that session that's moderated by Frank Wong. Very interesting, fast-paced, lots of details that you can walk away with. I put Shawn's email address in the chat box where everyone can see that. So we're good there. We've got webinar coming up. Gary Bogdansky is going to talk about BMPs for the Turf Care Center. That's going to be a really good one. And then we have holiday break. Lisa does not do live webinars during the holiday because nobody wants to take them. Recordings like this one, like other PBI-Gordon webinars, are available to you in the Learning Hub. You can find those. We'll put this code up again. And Shawn, do you have any other closing thoughts for us today?
No, I think we're good. Again, if anybody has questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I will answer those as soon as I possibly can.
Excellent. Thanks again for your time today. Thanks to everybody participating for your input, your questions, and we hope to see you online again soon. Have a great day, everybody.